Jackson Miller served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a military police K9 handler before a roadside IED left him with a prosthetic leg and PTSD. For 2 years, he lived alone in a small apartment on his meager disability check, fighting nightmares and isolation. That stormy evening, a mud-covered German shepherd puppy followed him home from the corner store. Despite barely affording his own meals, Jackson couldn't leave the trembling animal in the downpour. His decision to shelter the dog broke his building's strict no pets policy and risked eviction. With unpaid bills mounting and therapy costs increasing, Jackson sat in his sparse living room that night wondering how he would survive the month. Then his phone rang at midnight, a military official requesting an urgent meeting about the puppy's microchip scan. At dawn, 3 government vehicles pulled into his parking lot, and a woman in a military uniform approached his door carrying documents that would transform Jackson's broken life forever. The heavy rain battered against Jackson Miller's umbrella as he limped back from Eastside Grocery. The plastic bag containing ramen noodles, bread, and coffee swung gently against his prosthetic leg. Dinner for the next 3 days until his disability check arrived. Lightning flashed across the night sky, illuminating the empty suburban street. The clock on his phone read 8:45 p.m. Another lonely evening stretched ahead. 2 years had passed since he'd returned from his 3rd tour in Afghanistan. 2 years since the explosion that took his leg and the lives of 2 squad members. 2 years of trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life. The Department of Veterans Affairs provided the bare minimum: a prosthetic leg that needed adjustment, medication that dulled the nightmares but left him foggy, and a monthly check that barely covered his 1-bedroom apartment in the less desirable part of Riverdale. Jackson paused at the corner of Maple and Pine to adjust his umbrella. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through his jeans where they met his prosthetic. The moisture would cause chafing later, but he'd grown accustomed to discomfort. Physical pain was manageable compared to the memories that haunted him each night: the explosion, the screams, the smell of burning metal and flesh. A soft whimper cut through the drumming rain, so faint he nearly missed it. Jackson turned, scanning the dark street for the source. There, huddled against the brick wall of the abandoned laundromat, was a small shape shivering in the downpour. Another whimper, more desperate this time. "Hello?" Jackson called, taking a cautious step toward the sound. His military police training kicked in. Approach with caution, assess the situation, maintain situational awareness. The shape moved slightly, and Jackson saw it clearly for the first time. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 4 or 5 months old, covered in mud and trembling violently. The sight struck Jackson like a physical blow. German shepherds were the standard breed for military K9 units. For 3 tours, his partner had been a shepherd named Rex, loyal, brave, and ultimately sacrificed in the same explosion that took Jackson's leg. "Hey there, buddy," Jackson said softly, crouching down despite the sharp pain that shot through his residual limb. "Where'd you come from?" The puppy cowered, pressing itself harder against the brick wall. Its ribs showed clearly through mud-matted fur, and a makeshift cord was knotted around its neck, not even a proper collar. Jackson slowly extended his hand, palm down, the way he'd been trained to approach nervous K9s. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he murmured, keeping his voice low and calm. "Just want to help." After a moment's hesitation, the puppy stretched its neck forward, sniffing Jackson's fingers. Then, to his surprise, it gave his hand a quick lick before retreating back against the wall. Jackson checked his watch, 9 to 10 p.m. His apartment was still 6 blocks away, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. His leg socket was already uncomfortable from the moisture, and tomorrow he had a VA appointment he couldn't miss. The smart thing would be to call animal control and continue home. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the keypad. The puppy whimpered again, those dark eyes watching him with what Jackson couldn't help but interpret as hope. How many times had Rex looked at him with those same trusting eyes? "Screw it," Jackson muttered, putting his phone away. He set down his grocery bag and slowly removed his rain jacket. "Come here, buddy. Let's get you out of this rain." The puppy hesitated, then took a tentative step forward. Jackson carefully wrapped the jacket around the trembling animal, lifting it gently. The puppy was lighter than he expected. Definitely underfed. It squirmed briefly before settling against his chest, seeking warmth. "You're all right now," Jackson whispered, retrieving his groceries with his free hand. "I've got you." The walk home was awkward, with one arm holding the puppy and the other balancing groceries and the umbrella. His prosthetic leg protested with each step, the socket rubbing painfully against his skin. By the time Jackson reached his apartment building, his pants were soaked through and his residual limb was screaming in pain. The Riverdale apartment sign hung crookedly above the entrance, the R flickering in the storm. Jackson shifted the puppy in his arms as he entered the lobby, hoping to avoid Mrs. Grayson, the building manager who enforced the no pets policy with religious fervor. 3 tenants had been evicted in the last year for sneaking in animals. Jackson had almost reached the stairs when the office door swung open. Mrs. Grayson stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her floral housecoat, her eyes narrowing at the bundle in Jackson's arms. "Mr. Miller, what do you have there?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jackson froze, instinctively tightening his grip on the puppy. "Just some things from the store, Mrs. Grayson." "Things from the store don't whimper, Mr. Miller," she responded, taking a step closer. "You know the rules. No pets, no exceptions." The puppy chose that moment to poke its mud-covered head out from the jacket, blinking at Mrs. Grayson. "It's just for tonight," Jackson said quickly. "Found him in the storm. I'll call animal services in the morning." Mrs. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "You've been a quiet tenant, Mr. Miller. No complaints, rent only late twice. I appreciate your service to our country." She glanced at his prosthetic leg, visible where his wet pants clung to the metal and plastic. "One night, I'll check tomorrow afternoon. If that animal is still here, I'll have to issue a formal warning." Jackson nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Mrs. Grayson. I promise, just for tonight." In his apartment, Jackson gently set the puppy down in his small bathroom. The 1-bedroom unit was sparsely furnished. A second-hand couch, a coffee table covered with VA paperwork, a small TV he rarely watched, and a bed that went unmade most days. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo of his K9 unit. From his second tour, the puppy stood awkwardly on the bathroom tiles, looking up at Jackson with wary eyes. "Let's get you cleaned up," Jackson said, turning on the shower to warm. He carefully tested the temperature, memories flooding back of washing Rex after dusty patrols through Afghan villages. The puppy tensed as Jackson lifted it into the tub, but didn't resist. As the mud washed away, Jackson could see the puppy's condition more clearly. Male, definitely underfed, with what looked like healing scrapes on his flank. No collar, just that makeshift cord. Jackson gently removed it, noticing calluses where it had rubbed the skin raw. Anger flared in his chest. Whoever had tied this cord hadn't cared about the animal's comfort. After the bath, Jackson dried the puppy with his only clean towel, then examined him more thoroughly. No tags, no visible identification. The dog's coat was coming in nicely despite the malnutrition. The classic black and tan of a German shepherd with oversized paws that promised significant growth. "You're going to be a big boy," Jackson murmured, running his hand along the puppy's back. The animal responded by licking Jackson's hand again, then yawning widely. In the kitchen, Jackson opened a can of tuna, part of his own meager provisions, and set it on the floor. The puppy approached cautiously, then devoured the fish in seconds, looking up hopefully for more. "Sorry, buddy. That's all I can spare tonight," Jackson said, refilling a bowl with fresh water. "We'll figure something out tomorrow." Jackson checked his bank account on his phone, 4317, until his disability check arrived on Friday. His rent was already 2 weeks overdue, and the prescriptions he needed to refill would take most of what was coming. Adding dog food to his expenses wasn't feasible, not with the VA reducing his benefits. After their last review, claimed his PTSD was improving, despite his therapist's disagreement. The puppy padded into the living room, circling 3 times before curling up on the worn carpet. Jackson sat heavily on the couch, wincing as he removed his prosthetic. The skin beneath was red and irritated from the damp walk home. He should soak it, apply the special cream the VA provided, but exhaustion weighed on him like a physical burden. Tomorrow would bring complications, Mrs. Grayson's inspection, the animal control call he'd promised to make, his VA appointment to discuss reducing his pain medication again. Jackson leaned his head back against the couch, watching the puppy's sides rise and fall with each breath. Just for tonight, he whispered, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of sending this animal away. It had been 2 years since he'd had any real companionship. 2 years of therapy sessions where they encouraged him to reconnect while providing no meaningful way to do so. The puppy opened one eye, looking at Jackson as if understanding his thoughts. Then it stood, stretched, and to Jackson's surprise, limped over to the couch. Now that the mud was gone, Jackson could see the puppy favored its right front paw, holding it slightly above the ground when standing still. "You too, huh?" Jackson said, gesturing to his own missing limb. "Damaged goods." The puppy laid its head on Jackson's knee, looking up with those soulful eyes that reminded him so much of Rex. Jackson's hand automatically moved to scratch behind the dog's ears, the motion as natural as breathing. "What am I going to do with you?" he asked softly, though in his heart he already knew the answer. 1 night would become 2, then a week, then forever. Some connections couldn't be explained by logic or convenience. As if sensing the decision, the puppy hopped up onto the couch beside Jackson, curling against his side with a contented sigh. For the first time in months, the apartment didn't feel quite so empty. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jackson Miller didn't feel quite so alone. Jackson awoke with a start, his heart racing as the familiar nightmare faded. For a moment, he was disoriented, surprised to find himself on the couch rather than his bed. A warm weight pressed against his side reminded him of the previous night's rescue. The German Shepherd puppy was still curled up beside him, watching him with alert eyes. "Morning, buddy," Jackson murmured, his voice rough from sleep. The clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m. His VA appointment was at 9:30, leaving barely enough time to get across town on public transportation, with his prosthetic giving him trouble. The puppy yawned and stretched, then hopped down from the couch, limping slightly on his front paw. He circled the small living room, sniffing corners and furniture legs before looking back at Jackson expectantly. "Guess you need to go out, huh?" Jackson reached for his prosthetic, wincing as he slid it over his irritated skin. He hadn't properly cared for his residual limb last night, and now he was paying the price with angry red patches where the socket rubbed. Outside, the morning air was cool and damp after the night's storm. Jackson stood awkwardly in the small patch of grass behind the apartment building, watching as the puppy explored his new surroundings. Without a leash, Jackson worried the dog might bolt, but the animal stayed close, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure Jackson was still there. "We need to figure out what to do with you," Jackson said as the puppy finished his business. "I made a promise to Mrs. Grayson." Back in the apartment, Jackson opened his refrigerator, surveying its meager contents. Half a carton of eggs, some nearly expired milk, and condiment packets he'd collected from fast food restaurants. He cracked 2 eggs into a bowl, scrambling them quickly before dividing the portion, the larger half for the puppy, the smaller for himself. The dog devoured the eggs in seconds, licking the bowl clean before looking up hopefully for more. "That's all for now," Jackson told him, finishing his own small breakfast. "We're both on rations until Friday." Jackson's phone alarm beeped, reminding him of his appointment. He hurried through his morning routine, a quick shower, a fresh liner for his prosthetic, clean clothes that did little to hide his military posture. The puppy watched his every move, head tilted in curiosity. "I've got to go out for a bit," Jackson explained, feeling somewhat foolish for talking to the dog as if it could understand. "You need to stay quiet while I'm gone. Mrs. Grayson can't hear you, or we're both in trouble." The puppy sat at attention, ears perked forward. The posture was so reminiscent of military canines during briefing that Jackson felt a lump form in his throat. "I'll call about you when I get back," he promised, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Jackson created a makeshift bed from an old blanket, placing it in the corner of the bathroom along with a bowl of water. "This is safer for you, less trouble you can get into." The puppy trotted into the bathroom without protest, settling onto the blanket as if understanding the arrangement. Jackson closed the door gently, listening for any signs of distress. Hearing none, he grabbed his wallet and keys, heading out to catch the 8:15 bus. The VA hospital was a 30-minute ride across town, a sprawling complex of buildings that always seemed too small for the number of veterans seeking care. Jackson checked in at the mental health clinic, taking a seat in the crowded waiting room. All around him, men and women of various ages sat with the same vacant expressions, the same nervous habits, fingers drumming on armrests, legs bouncing rhythmically, eyes that never quite settled on any one spot. Jackson Miller, a nurse, called his name after 45 minutes of waiting. Dr. Patel's office was small but meticulously organized, with degrees and certifications covering one wall and a window overlooking the parking lot on another. The psychiatrist greeted Jackson with a firm handshake, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk. "How have you been, Jackson?" Dr. Patel asked, opening the thick file folder that contained 2 years of Jackson's struggles condensed into clinical language and medication logs. "Managing," Jackson replied, the standard answer he gave to everyone who asked. "Not good, not bad, just surviving another day." Dr. Patel nodded, making a note. "Any changes since our last appointment? Nightmares, anxiety attacks, changes in mood?" Jackson hesitated, wondering if he should mention the puppy. "Same nightmares, maybe less frequent, but more intense when they come." The appointment proceeded, as they always did. Questions about his medication compliance, his pain levels, his efforts to reintegrate into civilian society. Jackson answered mechanically, his mind drifting back to the puppy waiting in his bathroom. "The review board has recommended another reduction in your disability rating," Dr. Patel said, bringing Jackson's attention sharply back to the present. "They feel your condition has stabilized enough to warrant decreasing benefits." "Stabilized?" Jackson echoed, heat rising in his chest. "Doctor, I still can't sleep through the night. I still can't be in crowds. He cut himself off. Aware his voice had risen, Dr. Patel held up a placating hand. "I've noted my disagreement with their assessment in your file, but these decisions are increasingly made by administrators, not clinicians." "How much?" Jackson asked, already calculating the impact on his precarious finances. "Approximately 20% reduction, effective next month." Jackson felt the room tilt slightly. 20% less would mean choosing between rent and food, between medication and electricity, and now there was the puppy to consider. "Is there an appeal process?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. There was always an appeal process, buried in paperwork and delays that could stretch for months. Dr. Patel nodded, printing out several forms and sliding them across the desk. "He'll support your appeal, but I want to be honest about the timeline. These are taking 6 to 8 months to process currently." By the time Jackson left the VA hospital, clutching his reduced prescription and appeal paperwork, it was nearly noon. He sat heavily on the bus stop bench, staring at the papers in his hand as if they might transform into something more hopeful. 20%. How would he manage with 20% less when he was barely surviving now? The bus ride home was a blur of anxiety and mental calculations. Jackson barely noticed the other passengers, his mind consumed with numbers that refused to add up to anything but disaster. When he finally reached his stop, he sat for a moment, longer before the driver gently reminded him they had arrived. The walk from the bus stop to his apartment felt longer than usual, each step with his prosthetic, a reminder of how his life had been irrevocably altered. By the time he reached his building, his residual limb was throbbing painfully, the socket rubbing against raw skin. Jackson checked his mailbox in the lobby, finding only more bills and a notice from his landlord about his overdue rent. Mrs. Grayson's office door was closed, a small blessing he hadn't expected. He made his way up to his apartment, bracing himself for whatever destruction an unattended puppy might have caused. To his surprise, when he opened the bathroom door, he found no disaster. The puppy was still curled on the blanket, though he jumped up immediately when Jackson appeared, tail wagging excitedly. "Hey, buddy," Jackson said, kneeling despite the pain to greet the animal. "You were good while I was gone?" The puppy pressed against him, licking his hand and whining softly, as if telling Jackson about his lonely morning. Jackson found himself smiling for the first time that day, perhaps the first genuine smile in weeks. "Let's get you outside again," he suggested, rising stiffly. The walk down to the grassy area behind the building was easier, with the puppy trotting beside him, matching his awkward pace without complaint. Back in the apartment, Jackson collapsed onto the couch, removing his prosthetic with a groan of relief. The skin beneath was worse than the previous day, with spots that threatened to blister if not treated. He retrieved the special cream from his bathroom cabinet, applying it gently to the irritated areas. The puppy watched the process intently before climbing onto the couch and settling beside Jackson, head resting on his good leg. The simple gesture of companionship brought a tightness to Jackson's throat that he couldn't explain. "I should call animal control," he said aloud, reaching for his phone. "That's what I promised Mrs. Grayson. That's the responsible thing to do." The puppy looked up at him with those soulful brown eyes, trust evident in every line of his body. Jackson's finger hovered over the phone, the animal shelter number already pulled up on the screen. Jackson's thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like an eternity. The puppy continued to gaze up at him, unaware that his fate hung in the balance. With a deep sigh, Jackson put the phone down on the coffee table. "One more day," he told the puppy, scratching behind his ears, "just until I figure something out." The decision made, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced immediately by the practical concerns of caring for an animal. He needed dog food, a proper collar and leash, and some way to hide the puppy from Mrs. Grayson until he could find a more permanent solution. His bank account balance taunted him from his phone screen. $43.17, barely enough for dog food let, alone the other supplies. Jackson rubbed his temples, trying to ward off the stress headache beginning to form. The reduction in benefits wouldn't hit until next month, but his current finances were already stretched to breaking point. The puppy whined softly, as if sensing Jackson's distress. He nuzzled Jackson's hand, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. "It's okay, buddy," Jackson assured him, though he wasn't sure which of them needed the reassurance more. "We'll figure it out." A knock at the door startled them both. The puppy's ears perked up, his head tilting toward the sound. Jackson quickly motioned for him to stay quiet, then reached for his prosthetic. "Just a minute," he called, wincing as he reattached the limb over sensitive skin. He limped to the door, opening it just enough to see who had knocked without revealing the apartment's interior. Mrs. Grayson stood in the hallway, arms crossed over her chest, lips pursed in that perpetual expression of disapproval. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him stiffly, "I've come to check on that animal situation we discussed last night." Jackson swallowed hard, mind racing for an excuse. "I was just about to call animal control," he said, the lie sitting uncomfortably in his throat. "Had a VA appointment this morning." Mrs. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. "So, the animal is still here then?" A soft whine came from behind Jackson, followed by the click of nails on hardwood as the puppy approached the door, curious about the new voice. Jackson shifted his position, trying to block Mrs. Grayson's view. "Just until they can pick him up," Jackson explained hurriedly. "Should be later today." Mrs. Grayson was not easily deceived. She craned her neck, trying to see past Jackson. "You do understand our no-pets policy is non-negotiable, Mr. Miller. We've had to evict tenants for violations." The word evict hit Jackson like a physical blow. With his overdue rent and now the impending reduction in benefits, an eviction would be catastrophic. He'd seen too many veterans end up on the streets after similar circumstances. "I understand completely," he assured her. "The dog will be gone today." Mrs. Grayson studied his face for a long moment, clearly weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded once. "See that it is, Mr. Miller. I'll check back tomorrow morning." As she turned to leave, she added over her shoulder, "And your rent is now 17 days late. I've been lenient because of your service, but Mr. Donaldson is pushing for eviction notices for anyone more than 2 weeks behind." Jackson closed the door, leaning against it heavily. The puppy sat at his feet, looking up, with expectant eyes, unaware of the complications his presence created. "What am I going to do with you?" Jackson asked softly, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text message from his former squad mate, Dave Rodriguez. They'd served together for 2 tours before Dave had been transferred to a different unit just months before the IED that took Jackson's leg. "In town for the weekend. Beer tonight." Jackson stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He rarely socialized anymore, finding civilian conversations strained and military reminiscences too painful. But Dave had been persistent in maintaining contact, refusing to let Jackson isolate himself completely. "Can't tonight. Rain check?" Jackson typed, then deleted the message. Dave would only push harder if he sensed Jackson was withdrawing again. "Sure. My place or meet somewhere," he replied instead. Dave lived in a small house about 20 minutes away, inherited from his grandparents after his discharge. "Your place? 7? Can't afford a bar tab right now." Dave's response came immediately. "Perfect. I've got plenty of beer. See you then." Jackson set the phone down, considering his options. He couldn't leave the puppy alone in the apartment for too long. Not with Mrs. Grayson likely to be listening for any sounds of an animal. But he also couldn't turn down one of the few social connections he maintained. The solution came to him suddenly. He would take the puppy to Dave's. His former squad mate had always been an animal lover and might even have suggestions for Jackson's dilemma. It was risky to transport the dog without a proper carrier or leash, but less risky than leaving him to be discovered by Mrs. Grayson. With that decided, Jackson turned his attention to his most immediate need: food for the puppy. He searched his kitchen cupboards, finding a can of chicken breast that he'd been saving for himself. The dog watched intently as Jackson opened the can and emptied it into a bowl, adding a bit of the plain rice he had left over from 2 nights ago. "It's not proper dog food," Jackson apologized as he set the bowl down, "but it'll have to do for now." The puppy didn't seem to mind the improvised meal, wolfing it down eagerly before looking up for more. Jackson shook his head regretfully. "That's all for now, buddy. We're both on rations." While the dog explored the apartment, Jackson took stock of his own remaining food. With careful rationing, he might make it to Friday when his disability Check arrived, but adding the puppy's needs complicated things significantly. He was already 2 weeks late on rent, his phone bill was overdue, and now he faced a reduction in future benefits. The weight of his financial situation pressed down on him like a physical burden. Jackson sank onto the couch, the familiar darkness threatening to engulf him. In his darkest moments after returning home, he'd contemplated ending it all. The struggle, the pain, the endless battle, just to survive day to day. Only the thought of his mother, already devastated by his father's death years earlier, had stopped him. The puppy sensed Jackson's shift in mood, jumping onto the couch beside him and pressing against his side. The simple gesture of companionship pulled Jackson back from the edge of his thoughts. He scratched the dog's ears automatically, finding comfort in the rhythmic motion. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured. The puppy licked his hand in response, tail wagging slightly. For the next few hours, Jackson alternated between searching for a temporary leash solution and resting his leg. He finally fashioned a makeshift collar and leash from an old belt, cutting it down to size with scissors and poking a new hole for the buckle to fit the puppy's neck. "Not perfect, but it'll work for tonight," he told the dog, who submitted to the fitting with surprising patience. At 6:30, Jackson prepared to leave for Dave's house. He put on a clean shirt, one of the few he reserved for occasions outside the apartment, and reattached his prosthetic, grimacing at the contact with his irritated skin. The puppy watched these preparations with interest, seeming to understand that an adventure was imminent. "You're coming with me," Jackson explained as he attached the makeshift leash. "But you need to be quiet while we're in the hallway and lobby. Mrs. Grayson has ears like a bat." Getting out of the building without detection required timing and luck. Jackson waited until he heard Mrs. Grayson's television through her office door. Her evening soap operas were non-negotiable viewing before hurrying through the lobby with the puppy at his side. The dog seemed to understand the need for stealth, padding silently alongside Jackson without a single bark or whine. Once outside, Jackson breathed easier. The evening air was cool and pleasant after the stuffiness of his apartment. The puppy pulled slightly at the makeshift leash, eager to explore the new surroundings. "Easy, buddy," Jackson cautioned. "We've got a bus to catch." The bus driver raised an eyebrow at the sight of the dog, but said nothing as Jackson paid his fare. They took seats at the back, the puppy curling up at Jackson's feet as if he'd been trained for public transportation. Several passengers smiled at the dog, a few reaching out to pet him when the bus stopped to let people on or off. "What's his name?" an elderly woman asked, smiling as the puppy gently licked her offered hand. Jackson hesitated, realizing he hadn't given the dog a name yet. I'm still deciding," he admitted. "He looks like a hero to me," the woman said. "Something strong and brave would suit him." Her words stayed with Jackson as they completed the journey to Dave's neighborhood. A name would make the attachment real, would cement the decision he was still reluctant to fully make. Dave's house was a small bungalow on a quiet street, the front yard neatly maintained with military precision. Jackson recognized the discipline in the straight edges of the lawn and the geometrically arranged flower beds. Some habits followed you home from service, becoming anchors in a civilian world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The door opened before Jackson could knock, Dave's familiar grin greeting him. "Right on time, as always," he said, before his eyes dropped to the puppy. "And you brought a +1. Didn't know you had a dog." "It's a recent development," Jackson replied, suddenly uncertain about how to explain the situation. "Mind if he comes in? I couldn't leave him at the apartment." "Of course not." Dave stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Mi casa es su casa, man. That goes for the furry friend too." Dave's living room was sparsely furnished, but meticulously organized. A large couch facing a modest television, a coffee table with coasters arranged in perfect alignment, and military memorabilia displayed on the walls in symmetrical patterns. Jackson recognized the need for order that had followed them both from service to civilian life. "Beer?" Dave offered, heading toward the kitchen. Got that local IPA you liked last time? Thanks, Jackson replied, carefully unclipping the makeshift leash from the puppy's collar. The dog sat obediently at his feet, surveying the new environment with alert eyes. Dave returned with 2 bottles, handing one to Jackson before dropping into the armchair across from the couch. So, gonna tell me about your new buddy there? Jackson took a long sip of his beer before answering. Found him last night in the rain. No collar, no tags, half-starved. He hesitated, then added, he followed me home. Couldn't just leave him there. Dave nodded, his expression softening as he watched the puppy cautiously explore the perimeter of the living room. He's got military bearing. German Shepherd, right? Looks like he could be canine material with some training. That's what I thought, Jackson agreed. Reminds me of the dogs. From the unit, the puppy completed his inspection of the room and returned to Jackson's side, settling against his leg with a contented sigh. The simple trust in the gesture made Jackson's chest tighten. Problem is, my building has a strict no pets policy. Jackson continued, Mrs. Grayson, that's the manager. She's already threatened eviction if I don't get rid of him. Dave frowned. That's rough. You thinking of keeping him then? Jackson stared at his beer bottle, peeling at the label with his thumbnail. I don't know, man. I can barely take care of myself right now. The VA's cutting my benefits next month. I'm already behind on rent, and now... He gestured toward the puppy, who was watching him with those attentive brown eyes. Plus, I don't exactly have the most stable setup for a dog. Small apartment, 3rd floor, no yard. But you want to keep him, Dave said. It wasn't a question. Jackson nodded reluctantly. Yeah, I do. First time in 2 years I felt, I don't know, less alone, I guess. Dave leaned forward, setting his beer on a coaster. Therapy dogs are a thing, you know. The VA has that program now, pairs vets with service animals. Might be worth looking into. Could solve your housing problem too. They can't legally evict you for a service animal. I've heard the waiting list is over a year long, Jackson replied. And I'm not sure I'd qualify. They reserve those for the worst cases. Dave's expression darkened. You lost your leg and 2 squad mates, Jackson. You came home with enough shrapnel in your body to set off metal detectors. If that doesn't qualify as a worst case, what does? Jackson shrugged uncomfortably. He'd never been good at advocating for himself, always feeling there were others worse off, others more deserving of help. It was part of why he'd accepted the benefit reductions without much fight over the past year. Besides, Dave continued, this little guy found you for a reason. Might be fate or whatever you want to call it. The puppy's ears perked up as if he understood they were discussing him. He placed a paw on Jackson's knee, his head tilting slightly in that characteristic German Shepherd expression of curiosity. Have you checked if he's microchipped? Dave asked, reaching for his phone. My buddy works at that vet clinic over on Westwood. He might be able to scan him tonight if I call in a favor. Jackson shook his head. Didn't even think of that. I've been so focused on the housing situation. Dave was already dialing. Hey, Carlos, it's Dave Rodriguez. Yeah, good to hear your voice too. Listen, I've got a situation. Friend of mine found a German Shepherd puppy, no collar looks like. He's been on his own for a bit. Yeah, exactly. Any chance you could scan him for a microchip tonight? We're trying to figure out next steps. Really? That'd be great. We can be there in 20. He ended the call, grinning at Jackson. Carlos is just finishing up some paperwork. Says he can see us if we head over now. You sure I don't want to impose, Jackson said, even as relief washed over him. A microchip could solve everything. The puppy would go back to his rightful owners, and Jackson's dilemma would resolve itself. So why did the thought feel like a stone in his stomach? Dave was already grabbing his keys. Not an imposition. Carlos owes me anyway. I fixed his car last month when his mechanic was trying to overcharge him. The puppy seemed to understand they were going out again, standing at attention by the door, with what Jackson could have sworn was excitement in his posture. Jackson reattached the makeshift leash, noting that they'd need to stop for proper supplies if the dog did turn out to be his responsibility after all. Dave's pickup truck was parked in the driveway, meticulously washed and waxed despite being almost 10 years old. The puppy hesitated at the vehicle, looking up at Jackson uncertainly. "It's okay, buddy," Jackson assured him, lifting him carefully into the back seat. "Just another adventure." The vet clinic was a small building in a strip mall sandwiched between a convenience store and a dry cleaner. A neon open sign still glowed in the window, though the posted hours showed they should have closed an hour earlier. Carlos met them at the door, a lanky man with tired eyes and a warm smile. "Dave, good to see you," he greeted them, then bent down to the puppy's level. "And who do we have here?" "No name yet," Jackson explained. "Found him last night in the storm." Carlos nodded, leading them to an examination room. "Let's take a look at this little guy. Up on the table, please." Jackson lifted the puppy onto the stainless steel examination table. The dog sat nervously, pressing against Jackson's hand for reassurance. "He looks to be about 5 months old," Carlos observed, gently palpating the puppy's limbs and torso. "A bit undernourished, but otherwise in decent shape. This limp in his front paw. How long has he had that?" "Since I found him," Jackson replied. "I thought maybe he'd injured it recently." Carlos carefully examined the paw, extending and flexing it slowly. "Feels like an old injury that never healed properly. Not uncommon in strays or abandoned animals. Probably happened when he was very young." The parallel to his own injury wasn't lost on Jackson. He absently rubbed his thigh just above where his prosthetic attached. "Let's check for a microchip," Carlos said, reaching for a handheld scanner. He ran the device over the puppy's shoulders and neck, the standard location for implanted identification chips. The scanner remained silent, no beep indicating a detected chip. Carlos frowned, then methodically scanned the dog's entire body. "Sometimes they migrate from the original implant site," he explained. After a thorough scan, Carlos shook his head. "No chip that I can detect. If he belonged to someone who cared enough to look for him, they would have had him chipped." Jackson felt a complicated mix of emotions, disappointment that there was no easy resolution, but also a secret relief that he might be able to keep the dog after all. "Since he's here, want me to give him a quick checkup?" Carlos offered. "No charge. Consider it a favor for Dave's help with my car." "That would be great," Jackson agreed, stroking the puppy's head as Carlos gathered his instruments. The examination was thorough, but gentle. Carlos checked the dog's ears, eyes, and teeth, listened to his heart and lungs, and administered a quick dose of flea and tick preventative. "Overall, he's in surprisingly good shape for a stray," Carlos concluded. "The limp is from an old fracture that healed improperly, but it doesn't seem to cause him much pain. Could be corrected with surgery, but that's expensive and not strictly necessary if it's not bothering him." "Anything else I should know?" Jackson asked, realizing he was already thinking of the puppy as his responsibility. Carlos smiled knowingly. "Well, if you're planning to keep him, he'll need vaccinations, regular checkups, proper nutrition to get his weight up, and training. German Shepherds are smart dogs, but they need structure and exercise." Jackson nodded, mentally calculating the costs against his dwindling resources. Even the basic necessities would strain his budget, especially with the benefit reduction looming. "I've got some samples of puppy food you can take," Carlos offered, seeming to read Jackson's thoughts. "And a spare collar and leash someone donated. It's not much, but it might help until you decide what you're doing." "I appreciate that," Jackson said sincerely. As Carlos went to retrieve the supplies, Dave clapped a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "So, what's the plan now? No chip means no owner to return him to." Jackson looked down at the puppy, who gazed back with complete trust. "I don't know, man. I want to keep him, but with my situation..." "Sleep on it," Dave suggested. "You can..." Both crash at my place tonight if you want. Avoid the dragon lady at your apartment for a bit longer. The offer was tempting. Mrs. Grayson would be checking his apartment first thing in the morning, expecting the dog to be gone. One more night would give Jackson time to consider his options. You sure? Jackson asked. I don't want to impose. Dave rolled his eyes. Would I offer if I wasn't sure? Besides, it's been too quiet since Maria left. Might be nice to have some company around the house. Carlos returned with a bag containing puppy food samples, a red collar that looked almost new, and a matching leash. Here you go. Consider it a care package for your new friend. Thanks, Carlos. What do I owe you for? The exam? Jackson reached for his wallet, though he dreaded seeing how little remained inside. Carlos waved him off. Like I said, this one's on the house. Dave saved me a fortune on my car repairs. Just promise you'll bring this little guy back for his vaccinations once you've decided what you're doing. As they headed back to the truck, the puppy now sporting his new red collar, Jackson felt the weight of decision pressing on him. The responsible choice would be finding the dog a proper home with someone who could afford to care for him. But the thought of giving him up already felt impossible, like contemplating the loss of a limb, a sensation Jackson knew all too well. You know, Dave said as they drove back to his house, he needs a name. Can't keep calling him Buddy or Puppy forever. Jackson glanced at the dog, now sleeping peacefully in the back seat. A name would make it real, would solidify the connection that was already forming between them. It would be a commitment, a promise to this animal that had somehow found him when they both needed someone. Scout, Jackson said suddenly, the name, emerging from some deep part of his memory. His name is Scout. Dave's spare bedroom was small but comfortable, with a neatly made twin bed and a nightstand adorned only with a lamp and an alarm clock. The military corners on the bedsheets spoke of habits neither of them had shed since their discharge. Bathrooms. Down the hall, Dave said, setting a folded towel on the dresser. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. I head out for work at 6, but I'll leave the key so you can lock up when you go. Thanks for this, Jackson replied, genuine gratitude in his voice. One night to figure things out will help a lot. Scout padded around the perimeter of the room, sniffing each corner thoroughly before jumping onto the bed and settling in the middle of the mattress, his expression almost daring Jackson to object. Dave laughed. Looks like he's made himself at home. Sleep well, man. We'll talk more in the morning. After Dave left, Jackson sat on the edge of the bed beside Scout, absently stroking the dog's head while his mind worked through his limited options. The VA's disability reduction would make his already tight budget nearly impossible. Adding a dog's expenses seemed financially irresponsible. Yet the thought of surrendering Scout to a shelter felt increasingly wrong, like abandoning a squad mate. What are we going to do, Scout? He murmured. The newly named dog tilted his head, ears perked forward, as if genuinely considering the question. Then he yawned widely, curled into a tight ball, and promptly fell asleep. Jackson smiled despite himself. Good talk. He prepared for bed, removing his prosthetic with a sigh of relief and massaging the irritated skin of his residual limb. The day's activities had caused more discomfort than usual, reminders of his limitations that he typically tried to ignore. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. For the first time in months, Jackson didn't wake in a cold sweat from nightmares. Of the explosion, whether it was the change of environment or Scout's warm presence against his side, he slept through until morning light filtered through the blinds. Dave was already gone when Jackson awakened, a note on the kitchen counter, directing him to coffee and breakfast supplies. Scout trotted around the backyard while Jackson sipped his coffee on the porch steps, considering his next move. The red collar looked good on Scout, making him appear more like a beloved pet than a stray. Jackson checked the tag that came with it, a simple metal disc that could be engraved with contact information. Another expense to consider if he decided to keep the dog. Jackson's phone buzzed with a text from Dave. "Forgot to mention, my neighbor Jim works with veteran housing assistance. Might be worth talking to him about your situation. He'll be home around noon." A glimmer of hope. Jackson knew such programs existed but had never pursued them, always feeling others deserved help more than he did. But with Scout now in the equation, perhaps it was time to reconsider. At noon precisely, Jackson knocked on the neighbor's door, Scout sitting obediently at his side. Jim Gordon was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and the firm handshake of someone used to making quick assessments of character. Dave mentioned. "You might stop by," Jim said, inviting them in. "Nice-looking dog you've got there." "Thanks," Jackson replied, a surge of pride warming his chest at the comment. "His name's Scout. Found him a couple days ago." Jim's living room was cluttered but organized, with bookcases overflowing with paperwork and a desk covered in manila folders. "Have a seat," he offered, gesturing to the couch. "Dave gave me a rough outline of your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you." Jackson hesitated, unaccustomed to discussing his circumstances with strangers. Years of military stoicism had taught him to handle problems privately, to never show weakness. But Scout's presence beside him somehow made it easier to speak. 3. Tours in Afghanistan as an MPK-9 handler, he began. IED on the third tour took my leg and killed 2 squad mates. Been back 2 years. The VA's reducing my disability rating next month. Says I'm improving, but I'm already struggling. To make rent? Jim nodded, taking notes. "And now you've got Scout, but your building doesn't allow pets." "Exactly. Mrs. Grayson, the manager, she gave me 1 day to get rid of him. That was yesterday. Veterans with service-connected disabilities have some housing rights they often don't know about," Jim explained, pulling a folder from a stack on his desk. "The Fair Housing Act provides certain protections, especially regarding service animals or emotional support animals." Jackson shook his head. "Scout's not a service dog. I just found him 2 days ago." "But he could be," Jim said, pulling out several forms. The VA has expanded its mental health support programs, including animal companionship for veterans with PTSD or other service-connected mental health conditions. Given your service history and current diagnosis, you'd almost certainly qualify. The possibility hadn't occurred to Jackson. How long does something like that take? "Mrs. Grayson is expecting him gone today." "The full program takes time," Jim admitted, "but getting initial documentation for an emotional support animal can be expedited. I've got connections at the VA mental health services who could help. Would you be open to that?" Jackson looked down at Scout, who had settled against his prosthetic leg with complete trust. "Yes," he said firmly. "If it means keeping him, absolutely." Jim smiled. "Good. Let me make some calls." For the next hour, Jim spoke with various contacts at the VA, explaining Jackson's situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated bureaucracy many times before. Jackson sat quietly, occasionally answering questions when Jim relayed them from the person on the other end of the line. Finally, Jim hung up and turned to Jackson with a satisfied expression. "Dr. Eleanor Chang can see you at 2:30 today. She's authorized to evaluate and provide documentation for emotional support animals. If she approves, and based on your history, I believe she will, you'll have legal protection against eviction for having Scout." Relief washed over Jackson. I don't know what to say. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jim cautioned. "The documentation is just step 1. You'll still need resources for proper care, training, possibly even registration in the full-service dog program if appropriate." "One step at a time," Jackson said, the military mantra for overwhelming situations. Jim nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Now, before you go, let me give you some information about veteran housing programs. With your disability status, you might qualify for better accommodations at reduced cost, places that are already pet-friendly." Jackson left Jim's house with a folder of information and a 2:30 appointment at the VA Mental Health Services. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt something like optimism stir in his chest, not just for Scout, but for himself as well. The VA hospital looked different somehow as Jackson approached it that afternoon, less imposing than it had the previous day. Scout walked beside him, drawing smiles from passers-by with his alert posture and bright eyes. Several veterans stopped to pet him, sharing stories of their own service animals or pets waiting at home. Dr. Chang's office was on the 3rd floor, in the mental health wing that Jackson had visited many times before for his PTSD evaluations. Unlike the sterile examining rooms in the physical medicine department, her space was designed for comfort. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs and plants on the windowsill. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him, her handshake firm but gentle. "And this must be Scout. Jim Gordon told me about your situation." Jackson nodded, suddenly nervous. "Yes, ma'am. I appreciate you seeing us on such short notice." Dr. Chang smiled, bending to offer her hand to Scout, who sniffed it politely before allowing her to pet him. "Jim is a strong advocate for veterans. When he calls, I listen." The evaluation was more conversational than Jackson had expected. Dr. Chang asked about his military service, his transition to civilian life, his nightmares and anxiety. She observed his interaction with Scout, noting how the dog responded to Jackson's subtle cues and how Jackson's body language changed when engaging with the animal. "How have you been sleeping since Scout came into your life?" she asked, making notes on her tablet. Jackson considered the question. "Better, actually. Last night was the first time in months I didn't wake up from nightmares." Dr. Chang nodded, unsurprised. "And your anxiety levels. I see from your records that you've been prescribed medication for panic attacks." "Haven't felt the need for it these past 2 days," Jackson admitted. "Been too focused on figuring out what to do with Scout, I guess." "That's not uncommon, Doctor," Chang explained. "The responsibility of caring for an animal can shift focus outward, reducing the internal rumination that often accompanies PTSD and anxiety disorders. Additionally, the physical presence of an animal can provide grounding during episodes of hypervigilance or flashbacks." She set her tablet aside, meeting Jackson's eyes directly. "Mr. Miller, based on our conversation and your medical history, I believe an emotional support animal would provide significant therapeutic benefit in managing your service-connected PTSD and anxiety. I'm prepared to provide documentation to that effect today." Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Dr. Chang. There's more," she continued. "Given your experience as a canine handler and Scout's breed characteristics, I would like to refer you to our service dog training program. With proper training, Scout could potentially become a full-service animal, trained to perform specific tasks related to your disability." "What kind of tasks?" Jackson asked, intrigued by the possibility. "For veterans with PTSD, service dogs can be trained to create space in crowded environments, provide tactile stimulation during anxiety attacks, perform room checks to alleviate hypervigilance, and even wake you from nightmares. The program would evaluate both you and Scout for suitability and develop a personalized training plan." The possibilities expanded in Jackson's mind. Not just keeping Scout as a pet, but possibly regaining some of the independence and confidence he'd lost since his injury. The program also provides stipends for care expenses, Dr. Chang added, seemingly reading Jackson's concerns about the financial implications. Food, veterinary care, training equipment. The VA recognizes that these animals provide a medical service and supports their maintenance accordingly. By the time Jackson left Dr. Chang's office, he carried not only the emotional support animal, documentation that would protect him from Mrs. Grayson's eviction threats, but also referrals to the service dog training program and a list of resources for veteran housing assistance. Scout trotted beside him, seemingly aware that their futures had become inexorably linked. Jackson approached his apartment building with new confidence, Scout walking proudly beside him in his red collar. The official documentation from Dr. Chang was folded in his jacket pocket, a shield against Mrs. Grayson's no pets policy. He'd called Dave on the way back, sharing the positive developments of the afternoon. "That's great news, man," Dave had responded, genuine happiness in his voice. "Jim comes through again. Let me know how it goes with the Dragon Lady." As expected, Mrs. Grayson was monitoring the lobby when Jackson entered. Her eyes narrowed immediately at the sight of Scout, arms crossing over her floral housecoat in a gesture Jackson had come to recognize as her battle stance. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice sharp with disapproval, "I believe we had an agreement about that animal." Jackson took a deep breath, steeling himself for confrontation, something he'd avoided whenever possible since returning to civilian life. "Mrs. Grayson, there's been a development I need to discuss with you. Do you have a moment to talk in your office?" The formal request seemed to catch her off guard. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded curtly and led the way to her small office just off the lobby. The space was cluttered with building maintenance files and framed photos of cats. And irony not lost on Jackson given her strict no pets policy. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk while eyeing Scout warily. Jackson remained standing. "I'll keep this brief. Scout is now registered as my emotional support animal through the VA's mental health services." He removed the folder from his pocket, placing it on her desk. "This documentation confirms his status and my right to keep him in my residence under the Fair Housing Act, regardless of the building's pet policy." Mrs. Grayson's expression shifted from disapproval to surprise. She opened the folder, scanning the official letterhead and Dr. Chang's signature. "This is dated today," she observed, suspicion evident in her tone. "Yes," Jackson acknowledged. "After our conversation yesterday, I reached out to my VA resources. Given my service-connected disabilities, I qualified for expedited assessment." Mrs. Grayson studied the documents more carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jackson knew she was searching for a loophole, some way to challenge the sudden reversal of their situation. "I understand this is unexpected," Jackson continued, maintaining the formal tone that seemed to be working in his favor. "I'm willing to discuss reasonable accommodations regarding Scout's presence in the building, dedicated relief areas, noise management, additional security deposit if necessary." The professional approach was deliberate, a strategy Jim had suggested. Most housing managers back down quickly when presented with proper documentation and a cooperative attitude, he'd explained. They know the law isn't on their side in these cases. Mrs. Grayson finally looked up from the paperwork, her expression unreadable. "This appears to be in order," she conceded reluctantly. "However, there will need to be amendments to your lease agreement, and Mr. Donaldson will have to be informed." Jackson nodded. "Of course. I'm also prepared to discuss my rental payment situation. I've been connected with veteran housing assistance that may help resolve the current arrears." This information seemed to further disarm Mrs. Grayson, whose primary concern had always been the financial stability of the building's operations. "Very well. I'll prepare the necessary paperwork for your signature tomorrow. In the meantime..." She glanced at Scout, who had remained perfectly behaved throughout the exchange. "Please ensure he doesn't disturb other tenants." "Understood. Thank you for your accommodation, Mrs. Grayson." The victory felt monumental as Jackson climbed the stairs to his apartment, Scout trotting beside him. For the first time since his discharge, he had advocated for himself successfully, had pushed back against a system that seemed designed to wear down those who couldn't fight through its complexities. Inside his apartment, Jackson removed Scout's Lishan watched as the dog explored the familiar space, his posture more confident than it had been just days earlier. The red collar added a touch of personality, a visible sign that he belonged somewhere now. "We did it, Scout," Jackson said, lowering himself onto the couch. "First battle won." Scout jumped up beside him, resting his head on Jackson's lap with a contented sigh. The simple gesture of trust and affection brought a lump to Jackson's throat. How quickly this animal had become essential to his life, filling a void he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Jackson's phone buzzed with a text from Dave. "Victory confirmed. Dragon slain. Mission accomplished," Jackson typed back. "Dragon temporarily subdued. Thanks for everything." The next text was from Jim Gordon. "Dr. Chang called. Service dog program evaluation scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m. They're expediting your case." The speed of developments was almost dizzying after 2 years of bureaucratic delays and obstacles at every turn. Jackson wondered if he'd stumbled into some alternate reality where the system actually worked for veterans instead of against them. His refrigerator was still nearly empty, but the samples from Carlos would feed Scout for at least a few days. His own dinner would be ramen noodles again, but that hardly mattered now. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Jackson felt something like purpose returning to his life. He spent the evening researching German Shepherds on his phone, learning about their nutritional needs, exercise requirements, and training techniques. The breed was intelligent and energetic, requiring mental stimulation as well as physical activity. Their loyalty was legendary, but needed to be earned through consistent leadership and care. "Looks like we both have work to do," Jackson told Scout, who had fallen asleep with his head still resting on Jackson's thigh. The weekend passed in a blur of small but significant changes. Jackson cleared a space in the corner of his living room for Scout's bed, a folded blanket that would have to suffice until finances improved. He established a routine of morning and evening walks, finding that the exercise benefited his own health as much as Scout's. The regular movement seemed to ease the phantom pain in his missing limb, and the fresh air cleared his mind in ways therapy had never quite managed. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now stopped to chat, drawn by Scout's friendly demeanor. Mrs. Kozlowski from apartment 3B shared stories of the German Shepherd she'd had as a girl in Poland. Mr. Chen from across the hall offered leftover chicken from his family's dinner, explaining that it would otherwise go to waste. These small interactions, meaningless to most people, were revolutionary for Jackson. After 2 years of isolation, broken only by mandatory VA appointments and occasional meetups with Dave, the simple act of casual conversation with neighbors felt like rediscovering a forgotten language. Monday morning arrived with a nervous energy, reminiscent of mission briefings. Jackson dressed in his cleanest clothes, dark jeans with no tears, a button-up shirt he reserved for VA appointments, and boots polished out of habits that 3 tours had permanently instilled. Scout seemed to sense the importance of the day, sitting patiently as Jackson attached the red leash to his collar. The VA Service Dog Training Center occupied a modern building separate from the main hospital, set back from the road with a large fenced training yard visible from the parking lot. As Jackson approached the entrance, he observed handlers working with dogs of various breeds, practicing commands and maneuvers with focused precision. Inside, the reception area was bright and welcoming, with photographs of veterans and their service dogs covering one wall, visual testimonials to the program's success. A woman in her 50s with short grey hair and a confident stride approached them immediately. "Jackson Miller?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Winters, Program Director. Dr. Chang spoke highly of you." "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice," Jackson replied, shaking her hand. Margaret smiled, bending slightly to offer her hand to Scout, who sniffed it politely. "And this must be Scout. May I?" she asked, gesturing to indicate she wanted to examine him. At Jackson's nod, she ran professional hands over Scout's body, checking his structure and temperament with practiced efficiency. Scout tolerated the examination calmly, his eyes occasionally finding Jackson's for reassurance. "He's underweight but otherwise in decent shape," Margaret observed. "Good temperament, alert but not anxious." "How long did you say you've had him?" "Just 4 days," Jackson answered. Margaret raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised. 4 days? And he's already this responsive to you? That's unusual, especially for a stray with unknown history. She straightened up, regarding Jackson with new interest. "Dr. Chang mentioned you were a canine handler during your service. What unit?" "5th Military Police Battalion, attached to the 101st Airborne for my 3rd tour," Jackson replied. "Worked with a German shepherd named Rex for all 3 deployments." A look of recognition crossed Margaret's face. "Wait, Miller? Jackson Miller?" She studied his face more carefully. "You're not Rex Miller's handler, are you? The team that uncovered the weapons cache near Kandahar in 2018. Jackson nodded, surprised by her knowledge of his service record. "That was us. How did you know?" "I worked with the military working dog program for 15 years before transitioning to the VA, Margaret explained. The handler dog teams that saved lives were legendary among trainers. Rex was considered one of the best explosive detection dogs in theater. The mention of Rex brought a familiar ache to Jackson's chest. He was better than I deserved. Margaret seemed to understand the unspoken loss. "Come to my office, we should talk." Her office was functional rather than decorative, with training manuals lining the bookshelves and maps of the facility pinned to one wall. A mature German shepherd lay on a bed in the corner, rising to attention when they entered. "This is Ranger, my personal service dog," Margaret explained. "He's retired from active work now, but still likes to come to the office." Ranger and Scout engaged in the ritual greeting of dogs, circling, sniffing, establishing boundaries, without aggression. Margaret watched their interaction with professional interest before gesturing for Jackson to take a seat. "The standard process for our program involves evaluation, matching, and extensive training," she began. "Typically, we assess veterans for their specific needs, then pair them with dogs we've pre-selected and partially trained for service work." Jackson nodded, already preparing himself for the likelihood that Scout wouldn't qualify. The fact that he'd found Scout rather than being matched through the program probably violated protocols. However, Margaret continued, surprising him, there are occasionally exceptions for veterans with prior K9 handling experience who have already formed bonds with suitable dogs. "Based on what I've seen in just these few minutes, Scout shows remarkable potential," hope flickered in Jackson's chest. "You think he could qualify?" "It's not just about the dog qualifying," Margaret explained. "It's about the team you form together. The most technically proficient service dog in the world won't succeed without the right partnership with their handler." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Tell me about finding Scout. The details might be important." Jackson recounted the events of that rainy evening, the walk home from the grocery store, finding Scout huddled against the abandoned laundromat, the makeshift cord around his neck, and the immediate connection he'd felt despite his practical concerns. Margaret listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When Jackson described how Scout had followed him home without hesitation, her expression became thoughtful. "And he's been responsive to your cues from the beginning? No significant behavioral issues?" she asked. "None," Jackson confirmed. "He's still a puppy, curious and sometimes excitable, but he settles quickly. Seems to understand what I need before I even ask." Margaret nodded as if confirming a theory. "There's something I want to check." She picked up her phone, dialing a number from memory. "Diane, it's Margaret over at Service Dog Training. Can you run a quick check on microchip registrations for military working dogs discharged within the last year? Specifically, any German shepherds assigned to the 5th MP Battalion that might have had litters?" Yes, I know it's unusual, but I'm following a hunch. Call me back directly. She hung up, turning her attention back to Jackson. While we wait, let's do some preliminary evaluation exercises with Scout. Nothing formal, just want to see how he responds. They moved to a small training room adjacent to her office. The space was simple. Rubber floor mats, a few chairs, and various training tools organized on shelves along one wall. Margaret retrieved a clicker and several small treats from a container. Let's start with basic obedience. Show me what commands he already responds to. Jackson ran through the commands Scout had learned in their short time together. Sit, stay, come. Surprised at how naturally the training language returned to him after 2 years away from K9 work. Scout responded eagerly, his focus unwavering. Despite the new environment, now let's try something he hasn't been taught, Margaret suggested, handing Jackson the clicker. See if you can get him to circle around that chair using just the clicker for marking correct movements. The exercise was standard protocol for assessing a dog's problem-solving abilities and willingness to work. Jackson remembered using similar techniques with Rex during their early training days. He clicked when Scout made even the slightest movement in the right direction, gradually shaping the behavior until the dog completed a full circle around the chair. Remarkable, Margaret commented. That usually takes several sessions. He's anticipating what you want. They progressed through several more exercises, targeting objects with his nose, retrieving items Jackson pointed to, maintaining position despite distractions. Throughout it all, Scout worked with an intensity of focus that belied his young age and lack of formal training. One more test, Margaret said, handing Jackson a small rubber ball. Throw this down the hallway, but signal him to stay. Let's see how he handles conflicting desires. Jackson tossed the ball, which bounced tantalizingly down the corridor. Scout's eyes tracked it eagerly, his body tensing with the instinct to chase, but when Jackson gave the subtle hand signal for stay, the dog remained rooted in place, looking up for confirmation that he'd made the right choice. Good boy, Jackson praised, releasing him with a nod. Scout bounded after the ball, retrieving it proudly. Margaret's phone rang just as they returned to her office. She listened for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly intrigued. Send me everything you've got. Thanks, Diane. She hung up, fixing Jackson with an intense gaze. Did Rex survive the IED blast that took your leg? The question caught Jackson off guard. No, he was closer to the explosion than I was. Died instantly. I'm sorry, Margaret said sincerely. The loss of a canine partner can be as devastating as losing a human teammate. Jackson nodded, the familiar grief rising in his chest. 2 years had dulled the edge but never erased the pain of losing Rex in that moment of fire and chaos. Rex's breeding record shows he sired a litter about a year before your final deployment, Margaret continued. Standard procedure for exceptional working dogs with desirable traits. Most of those puppies went into the military working dog program, but 2 females were placed with a private breeder who supplies police canines. She pulled up an email on her computer, scanning it quickly. One of those females, Sierra, was purchased by the Riverside Police Department's K9 unit last year. According to their records, she had a litter of puppies approximately 5 months ago. Jackson's heart rate quickened as he began to see where this was leading. Are you saying? I'm saying it's possible. Not certain, but possible. That Scout is genetically related to Rex, a grandson essentially. The possibility was stunning. Jackson looked at Scout, searching for similarities he might have missed. The shape of the muzzle, the intelligent eyes, the particular tilt of the head when concentrating, features that had seemed vaguely familiar from the beginning. There's a simple way to confirm, Margaret said. DNA testing. We do it routinely. And for our breeding program, results take about a week, but I can expedite it given the circumstances. Yes, Jackson agreed immediately. I'd like to know for sure. Margaret nodded, reaching for a testing kit in her desk drawer. 1 cheek swab, And we'll have our answer soon. In the meantime, I think we can proceed under the assumption that Scout has the genetic potential for service work, given his lineage and what I've observed today. The swab was quick and painless, Scout tolerating it with the same patience he'd shown throughout the evaluation. Margaret labeled the sample and set it aside for processing. "Now, let's discuss the program requirements," she said, returning to her business-like efficiency. "Normally, veterans are paired with dogs we've already begun training. But your case is unique. Your K9 handling experience combined with Scout's apparent aptitude makes him a good candidate for owner-trained certification." "What does that involve?" Jackson asked. "Essentially, you would work with our trainers to prepare Scout for service tasks specific to your needs. It's intensive, twice-weekly sessions here at the center, plus daily homework. The process typically takes 6 to 9 months for a dog Scout's age." Jackson considered this timeline against his financial situation. Even with the VA covering training costs, he still faced immediate challenges: rent arrears, benefit reductions, and daily expenses. For both himself and Scout, Margaret seemed to read his thoughts. There's a stipend available for qualified participants, covering basic necessities for both you and the dog during training. Additionally, veterans in the program have access to transitional housing if their current living situation becomes untenable. The offer of comprehensive support was unexpected. After years of navigating fragmented services and enduring benefit reductions, the sudden availability of resources felt almost suspicious. "Why the special treatment?" Jackson asked bluntly. "I've been fighting the VA system for 2 years just to maintain basic benefits. Now suddenly there's all this help available?" Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "2 reasons. First, the service dog program operates under different funding and administrative structures than standard VA benefits. We have more flexibility and dedicated resources. Second, frankly, your background as an experienced K9 handler makes you an ideal candidate for success. We want you to succeed, Jackson." Scout pressed against Jackson's leg as if offering his own encouragement. The contact grounded him, a physical reminder of how quickly this animal had become essential to his well-being. "What's next then?" he asked. "We begin training immediately," Margaret replied. "Today, if you're willing. The sooner Scout learns specific service tasks, the sooner you'll have documentation of his working status beyond just emotional support." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of introductory training exercises. Jackson met with a behavioral specialist who assessed his specific needs, anxiety triggers, physical limitations from his prosthetic, sleep disturbance patterns, and began developing a customized training plan for Scout. By mid-afternoon, Scout had already learned the rudiments of 2 service tasks: applying pressure therapy during anxiety episodes by lying across Jackson's lap, and performing a basic room check to alleviate hypervigilance upon entering new spaces. "He's a natural," the trainer commented. "Most dogs take weeks to grasp these concepts. The bond between you is accelerating the process exponentially." As they prepared to leave, Margaret provided Jackson with training materials: a proper service dog in training vest for Scout, and paperwork for the housing assistance program. "One more thing," she said, reaching into her desk. "This isn't standard procedure, but given the circumstances, I think it's appropriate." She handed Jackson a small velvet pouch. Inside was a dog tag, identical in size and shape to military identification tags. Engraved on one side was Rex's name and service number. On the reverse, "Valor and Loyalty, 5th MP Battalion." "How did you—" Jackson began, emotion catching in his throat. "I made some calls while you were with the trainer," Margaret explained. "Rex's service tags were stored with his records after he was lost in action. I thought perhaps his legacy should continue with Scout." regardless of what the DNA test shows. Jackson closed his fingers around the tag, the metal warm in his palm. "Thank you," he managed, the simple words inadequate for the gesture's significance. "Bring Scout back on Wednesday for your first official training session," Margaret instructed, as they headed toward the exit. "The Housing Assistance Office will contact you tomorrow about your options. In the meantime, continue working on the basic exercises we covered today." The afternoon sun was warm on Jackson's face as they left the training center, a stark contrast to the rainy night when Scout had entered his life just 4 days earlier. 4 days that had somehow altered the trajectory of Jackson's isolated existence, introducing possibilities that had seemed unattainable just a week ago. Scout walked beside him with newfound purpose, his red collar now joined by the special tag that connected him to Rex. The weight of responsibility sat differently on Jackson's shoulders now. Not a burden to bear alone, but a shared mission with his new partner. For the first time since the explosion that had taken his leg and his canine partner, Jackson felt the fog of grief and isolation begin to lift. There would still be battles ahead, bureaucratic hurdles, financial challenges, the ongoing struggle with his physical and mental wounds, but he would no longer face them alone. As they waited at the bus stop, an elderly veteran approached, noticing Scout's training vest. "Service dog?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. "In training?" Jackson confirmed. The man nodded with understanding. "Had one myself after Nam. Best medicine I ever got. Better than all the pills and therapy. Sessions combined. I'm beginning to see that," Jackson replied. "It's the partnership," the older veteran said, tapping his temple. "Gives you something beyond yourself to focus on. Changes everything." He offered a respectful nod before continuing on his way. Changes everything. The simple phrase echoed in Jackson's mind as they boarded the bus home. 4 days ago, he'd been a solitary, struggling veteran with dwindling resources and fading hope. Now, he sat with a purpose beside him, tangible plans ahead, and connections to resources he hadn't known existed. All because a muddy, abandoned puppy had followed him home in the rain. The following days established a new rhythm to Jackson's life, a structure he hadn't realized how desperately he needed. Each morning began with Scout's training exercises, practicing the service tasks they'd learned at the center. Afternoons were dedicated to apartment hunting through the veteran housing program, and evenings were spent reviewing training manuals while Scout lay contentedly at his feet. Wednesday's training session at the VA Center introduced Scout to more advanced tasks. The trainer, a former Army K-9 handler named Miguel, worked with them on block commands, teaching Scout to position himself between Jackson and approaching strangers to create personal space in crowded environments. "Your military background is showing," Miguel commented as he observed their work. "Most clients take weeks to establish the timing and consistency you've already developed." "Muscle memory, I guess," Jackson replied, rewarding Scout with praise for another perfectly executed maneuver. "Working with Rex was second nature by our third tour." "The dogs remember too," Miguel said thoughtfully, "even across generations. It's in their blood, this desire to work and protect." By Friday, the DNA results Margaret had expedited arrived. She called Jackson personally rather than waiting for their next scheduled session. "The test confirms it," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "Scout is definitely from Rex's genetic line, his grandson through the female Sierra. The markers are unmistakable." Though Jackson had already suspected this truth, the confirmation still hit him with unexpected force. It wasn't just coincidence that Scout had found him that night. wasn't just chance that they'd formed such an immediate bond. The connection was literally in Scout's DNA, a biological link to the partner Jackson had lost. There's more, Margaret continued. I've been in touch with the Riverside Police Department about Sierra's litter. According to their records, 5 puppies were born, all slated for canine training programs. However, during an evaluation exercise at 14 weeks, the smallest male, Scout, we presume, showed a slight hesitation during obstacle training due to his front paw injury. He was deemed unsuitable for police work and was supposed to be placed in the department's community adoption program. But something went wrong, Jackson guessed. Exactly. There was an administrative mix-up. The officer responsible for Scout's placement was transferred suddenly, and somehow Scout's paperwork was lost in the transition. By the time anyone realized he was missing, nearly 3 weeks had passed. They conducted a brief search, but assumed he had either been stolen or had somehow escaped from the training facility. The pieces were falling into place. Scout's good health despite being astray, his immediate response to training commands, the military-style discipline evident in his behavior despite his young age. He wasn't abandoned, Jackson said, feeling a strange relief at this knowledge. He was lost in the system. It appears so, Margaret agreed, and somehow, against all odds, he found his way to the grandson of his grandfather's handler. The statistical probability is... Don't tell me the odds, Jackson interrupted, remembering the old military superstition against calculating survival chances before a dangerous mission. Some things just happen for reasons beyond statistics. The Housing Assistance Program moved with surprising efficiency. By the following Monday, Jackson and Scout toured 3 different apartment complexes specifically designed for veterans with disabilities. The third property, Patriot Gardens, immediately felt right. Ground floor units for easier access with his prosthetic, a dedicated dog park on the premises, and rent calibrated to a percentage of his income rather than a fixed amount. Even with your benefit reduction, you'd qualify for our most affordable tier, the property manager explained as they walked through a 1-bedroom unit. Plus, all utilities are included, and we have on-site VA liaison officers to help with paperwork and benefit appeals. The apartment was nearly twice the size of his current place, a bedroom large enough for a proper bed frame rather than just a mattress, a kitchen with actual counter space, and a small patio that opened onto a grassy common area. Most importantly, it welcomed service animals not just as legal necessities, but as valued members of the community. How soon could we move in? Jackson asked, watching Scout explore the space with tail-wagging approval. We have an opening next week if you're interested. The unit needs minor repairs and cleaning, but nothing that would delay your move-in significantly. The timing was perfect. His current rent was due again in 10 days, money he simply didn't have. Mrs. Grayson had grudgingly accepted Scout's presence thanks to the VA documentation, but Jackson's financial arrears remained a looming threat. Take it, he decided. Dave arrived early Saturday morning with his pickup truck and 2 friends from his construction job, ready to help with Jackson's move. The process took less than 2 hours, a stark reminder of how few possessions Jackson had accumulated since his discharge. This place is sweet, Dave commented as they carried the last box into the new apartment. Way better than that dump you were in before. Jackson couldn't disagree. Patriot Gardens felt more like a community than a mere apartment complex. During the move, 3 different neighbors had introduced themselves, all veterans, all with their own service dogs or companion animals. One had even invited Jackson to the weekly barbecue held in the common area every Sunday. Hard to believe. This all happened because Scout followed me home that night, Jackson said, watching as the puppy investigated every corner of their new home. 2 weeks ago, I was facing eviction and benefit cuts with nowhere to turn. Dave clapped a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the universe throws you a bone, literally in this case. After Dave and his friends departed, Jackson and Scout took their first walk around the Patriot Gardens grounds. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-maintained lawns, and several residents nodded greetings as they passed. At the dog park, Scout immediately began socializing with the other service dogs, a chocolate lab with a veteran in a wheelchair, a Belgian Malinois accompanying a woman with visible burn scars, and a mixed-breed therapy dog whose handler introduced himself as the community's unofficial social director, Jackson Miller, he said, extending his hand. Just moved in today with Scout. Tony Vasquez, the man replied with a firm handshake. Afghanistan, 2010 to 2013. You? Same. 3 tours ending in 2018. Tony nodded, the simple exchange conveying volumes of shared understanding that civilian conversations rarely achieved. Welcome to Patriot Gardens. We look out for each other here. That evening, exhausted but content, Jackson sat on his new patio, watching Scout explore the fenced area. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. DNA results officially entered in Scout's service record. Training session still on for Monday? We'll be there, Jackson replied, adding, Scout approves of the new place. Margaret's response came quickly. Excellent. By the way, contacted Riverside PD about Scout's status. They're officially transferring ownership to you through our program. No more worries about someone claiming him? The news lifted the last lingering concern from Jackson's mind. Scout was truly his now, legally, genetically, and in every way that mattered. He attached Rex's tag to Scout's collar, the metal catching the light, as Scout bounded back to his side. Officially partners now, buddy, Jackson told him, scratching behind his ears. Scout responded by placing his paw on Jackson's knee, a gesture that had already become their personal sign of connection. Sunday morning brought unexpected visitors. 2 representatives from the VA appeals office who had reviewed Jackson's case following Dr. Chang's intervention. We've reassessed your disability rating, the senior officer explained as they sat at Jackson's new kitchen table. Based on Dr. Chang's evaluation and your participation in the service dog program, we're reinstating your previous benefits level, with additional consideration for the documented intensification of PTSD symptoms noted in your file. What does that mean exactly? Jackson asked, Scout sitting alertly at his side. It means your benefits will increase by approximately 15% rather than decrease by 20% as previously planned, the officer clarified. Additionally, we're approving back payments for the reductions implemented over the past 6 months, as those appear to have been processed despite ongoing appeals. Jackson struggled to process this reversal of fortune. After 2 years of fighting a losing battle with the VA bureaucracy, suddenly the system was working in his favor. Why the change? He asked bluntly. The junior officer, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Frankly, Mr. Miller, your case got flagged by multiple departments simultaneously: mental health, prosthetics, and the service dog program. When that happens, it triggers an automatic comprehensive review. The coordination between departments revealed inconsistencies in how your benefits were being calculated. What he means, the senior officer added with a slight smile, is that sometimes it takes a perfect storm to cut through red tape. The service dog program has particularly strong advocacy channels. Once Dr. Chang and Ms. Winters became involved, things started moving quickly. After they departed, Jackson sat quietly on his patio, Scout resting at his feet. The events of the past 2 weeks seemed almost surreal in their rapid succession of positive developments. From the brink of eviction and further benefit reductions, to a new home, a service dog with a remarkable connection to his past, and now financial stability he hadn't dared hope for. The Sunday barbecue in the common area provided Jackson's first real experience of community since his discharge. Veterans from different eras mingled easily, their service animals creating additional bonds between handlers. Jackson found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken of in years, listening to experiences that echoed his own, and for the first time since returning home, feeling truly understood. Tony Vasquez introduced him to the residents he hadn't yet met, including several who worked with the same VA service dog program. Most of us here have gone through similar journeys, Tony explained. The isolation, the struggle with benefits, the search for purpose. The dogs are the common thread. They lead us back to connection. As the evening wound down, Jackson sat, with Scout beside the community fire pit, watching the flames dance in the gathering darkness. Around him, conversations continued in small groups, punctuated by occasional laughter and the contented sighs of resting dogs. A woman named Rachel, who had earlier identified herself as an army combat medic with 2 tours in Iraq, joined him on the bench. Her service dog, the Belgian Malinois named Athena, settled beside Scout with familiar ease. "Tony says you've only had Scout for 2 weeks," she commented. "That's hard to believe watching you together. You move like you've been partners for years." "Sometimes it feels that way," Jackson admitted. "There's a connection I can't really explain." "Well, I can explain part of it. Turns out he's related to my military working dog from Afghanistan. But there's something more. Something that doesn't fit into neat scientific categories." Rachel nodded, understanding without need for further elaboration. "Athena found me at my lowest point too. Different circumstances, but same result. Sometimes I think they're sent to us, you know. Guardian angels with 4 legs instead of wings." The simple poetry of her description resonated with Jackson. He watched Scout, now dozing peacefully beside Athena, the red collar adorned with Rex's military tag rising and falling with each breath. Guardian angels, genetic legacy, cosmic coincidence. The explanations didn't really matter. What mattered was the undeniable fact that 2 broken beings had somehow found each other in the rain. Beginning a journey of healing neither could have navigated alone. The next morning, Jackson received a call from Margaret at the training center. The slightly urgent tone in her voice immediately put him on alert. "Jackson, I have some unexpected news," she began. "The Riverside Police Department K-9 unit commander contacted me this morning. Apparently, our inquiry about Scout's history flagged something in their system." Jackson felt a knot form in his stomach. What kind of something? The officer who was originally responsible for Scout's placement has returned from medical leave. "He's quite concerned about what happened and wants to meet with you. I assured him Scout is in excellent hands, but he was rather insistent." Scout looked up from his bed in the corner, ears perked as if sensing Jackson's sudden anxiety. The thought of someone potentially claiming Scout, even with the assurances of official transfer, sent a wave of panic through Jackson's chest. "Did he indicate he wants Scout back?" Jackson asked, struggling to keep his voice level. "No, nothing like that," Margaret assured him quickly. "The transfer documentation is already processed. Scout is legally yours." The officer just expressed a strong desire to see Scout and explain the situation personally. His name is Lieutenant Thomas Reeves. He's willing to meet wherever you're comfortable. Jackson exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "When does he want to meet?" "He's actually in the area today for a training seminar. He suggested early afternoon if possible." After a moment's consideration, Jackson agreed. "The dog park at Patriot Gardens would work. Scout is comfortable there and it's public enough." "Perfect. I'll let Lieutenant Reeves know. He'll be there at 2 p.m. "Jackson," Margaret added, her voice softening, "try not to worry. This is just procedural follow-up. Scout is your dog now." Despite Margaret's reassurances, the hours until the meeting crawled by with excruciating slowness. Jackson distracted himself by continuing to unpack and arrange their new apartment, but his mind kept returning to worst-case scenarios. What if this officer had some special attachment to Scout? What if there was a problem with the transfer paperwork? What if Scout interrupted these spiraling thoughts by bringing his training toy, a small rope knot, and dropping it at Jackson's feet with an expectant whine? The simple request for play pulled Jackson back to the present moment. "You're right, buddy," he said, picking up the toy. "No point worrying about what we can't control." They spent the next hour practicing service, tasks interspersed with play breaks, Scout's enthusiastic focus gradually calming Jackson's anxiety. By the time they headed to the dog park for the meeting, Jackson had regained his equilibrium. The park was relatively quiet in the early afternoon heat. A few residents walked the perimeter with their dogs, but the main play area was empty. Jackson found a bench in the shade and settled in to wait, Scout lying attentively at his feet. At precisely 2 p.m., a black SUV with government plates pulled into the visitor parking area. A man in his 50s emerged, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. His salt and pepper hair was cut in a traditional high and tight style, and he moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. Scout's posture changed subtly as the man approached. Not tense or defensive, but alert and focused, recognizing the demeanor of someone from his early training environment. "Jackson Miller?" the man called as he neared. "Lieutenant Thomas Reeves, Riverside PD K9 Unit." Jackson stood, extending his hand. "Lieutenant, this is Scout." Reeves shook Jackson's hand firmly, then knelt to Scout's level, offering his palm for inspection. Scout sniffed carefully before giving the hand a tentative lick of approval. "He remembers me," Reeves said softly, genuine emotion in his voice. "I wasn't sure he would," Jackson gestured to the bench. "You were involved in his early training?" Reeves nodded, taking a seat beside Jackson while maintaining eye contact with Scout. "I was his primary handler from week 8 to week 14, when the eval team pulled him from the program due to his paw injury. I was told there was an administrative mix-up," Jackson prompted, "that his placement paperwork got lost when you were transferred." A shadow crossed Reeves's face. "That's the official report, yes. The reality is a bit more complicated." He glanced around, ensuring they had privacy before continuing. "I wasn't transferred. I had a heart attack, major one, went from active duty to hospital bed in the span of an hour, was out for nearly 2 months." "I'm sorry to hear that," Jackson said. Reeves waved off the sympathy. Part of getting older. The point is, Scout was my special project. When the evaluation team rejected him for service because of his paw, I had already arranged a private placement for him with my daughter's family. She has 2 young boys with autism, and Scout showed exceptional aptitude for emotional regulation. Work even without formal training. Understanding began to dawn on Jackson, but you were hospitalized before you could complete the placement. Exactly. And department protocol dictates that rejected dogs go through the official adoption program unless special exemptions are filed. Without me there to process Scout's exemption paperwork, he was just another rejected candidate in the system. Reeves reached into his pocket, removing a phone which he handed to Jackson. On the screen was a photograph of Scout at perhaps 12 weeks old, sitting patiently beside 2 young boys, perhaps 5 and 7 years old. That was taken during a supervised home visit. The connection was immediate. Those are my grandsons, Tyler and Aaron. Jackson studied the photo, noting the gentle patience in Scout's posture even as a young puppy. The same patience he showed now in his service work. When I finally returned to duty, Reeves continued, Scout was already missing. There was an investigation, but it was half-hearted at best. Most assumed he'd been adopted unofficially by someone in the department, which happens sometimes with promising dogs who don't quite make the cut. My daughter was devastated. The boys had been counting down the days until Scout would come live with them. A complicated guilt settled in Jackson's chest. Scout had been destined for another important purpose, another family who needed him. Lieutenant, I don't know what to say. If Scout was promised to your family, Reeves held up a hand, stopping Jackson mid-sentence. That's not why I'm here, son. I'm not asking for Scout back. Then why did you want to meet? Jackson asked, confused. 2 reasons. First, I needed to see for myself that Scout was okay. When Margaret contacted our department about his history and mentioned he'd been found as a stray, I was concerned about what he might have endured between disappearing from our facility and finding you. Scout chose that moment to rest his head on Jackson's knee, the gesture of trust and connection not lost on either man. Clearly, he's more than okay, Reeves acknowledged with a small smile. The second reason is more personal. I wanted to understand how Scout ended up with you specifically. When Margaret mentioned your military K9 handler background and that Scout was now in service dog training, it seemed like more than coincidence. Jackson briefly explained the rainy night encounter, Scout's immediate connection to him, and the subsequent discovery of Scout's genetic relationship to Rex. As he spoke, Reeves's expression shifted from curious to astonished. You're telling me Scout is the grandson of your military K9 partner? The one you lost in Afghanistan? DNA testing confirmed it last week, Jackson said, reflexively touching the military tag now attached to Scout's collar. Reeves sat back, shaking his head in wonder. Well, that explains a lot. We noticed Scout's exceptional aptitude from the beginning. His focus, his intuitive response to commands, his problem-solving abilities. Those traits are highly heritable in working lines. And the fact that he sought you out specifically. He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. It's hard to explain without sounding mystical, Jackson admitted. But it feels like more than random chance. Some things are meant to be, Reeves said simply. He studied Scout for a long moment before continuing. I came here prepared to make a difficult decision. My daughter's family still wants a support dog for the boys. When I heard Scout had been found, my first instinct was to try to reclaim him for them. Jackson tensed, but Reeves continued quickly. But seeing you two together, hearing the remarkable circumstances that brought you together, I couldn't separate you even if I had the legal authority to do so, which I don't. Scout has found exactly where he belongs. Relief washed over Jackson. Thank you for understanding. I'm sorry for your daughter's family, though. They must have been disappointed all over again when they heard Scout had been found, but wouldn't be coming to them. That's actually the third reason for my visit, though I hadn't planned to bring it up, Reeves said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Jackson. Sierra, Scout's mother, is expecting another litter next month. My department has already agreed to let me have first pick for my daughter's family. But given Scout's exceptional progress with you, I'd like to consult with you during the puppy selection process. Your insights as a handler working with Scout could help ensure we choose the puppy with the best temperament for children with special needs. The request was unexpected, but deeply meaningful, a recognition of Jackson's professional expertise that had lain dormant for too long. I'd be honored, Lieutenant. Scout and I both would. Reeves smiled, genuine warmth replacing the official demeanor he'd maintained throughout their conversation. Call me Tom, and I believe this could benefit everyone. My grandsons get a service dog specifically selected for their needs. You get to participate in continuing Rex's remarkable legacy, and the VA program gains valuable data on genetic predisposition in service animals. As if understanding the significance of the discussion, Scout sat up straighter, looking between the two men with alert interest. There's one more thing you should know about Scout, Reeves said, his tone becoming more serious. The reason he was initially rejected from the police K-9 program wasn't just his paw injury. The evaluation team had concerns about what they termed his excessive empathic response. Meaning, Jackson prompted, meaning he showed an unusual level of sensitivity to human emotional states. Most police K-9s are trained to maintain task focus regardless of handler stress levels. Scout consistently broke protocol to check on his handler when they exhibited signs of distress. The evaluation team saw it as a liability for police work. Jackson thought about how Scout had responded to his nightmares, his anxiety attacks, his moments of deepest depression, always with that same intuitive awareness, that same calming presence. What was a liability for police work is his greatest strength as a service dog, Jackson observed. Reeves nodded. Exactly. Some dogs are born for different purposes than what we initially imagined for them. Scout wasn't meant to chase suspects or detect narcotics. He was meant to heal. The simple truth of this statement resonated deeply with Jackson. Like Scout, he had returned from war with different capabilities than those he'd left with. The skills that had made him an effective soldier weren't always applicable to civilian life, but new purposes had emerged from his experiences. I understand. That better than most, Jackson admitted. As they concluded their meeting, Reeves asked if he could take a current photo of Scout to show his grandsons. They've been worried about him. It would help them understand that he's where he needs to be doing important work, Jackson agreed, and Scout posed patiently between the two men, his intelligent eyes focused on the camera as if he understood the significance of the moment. 3 generations of service connected through this young dog. Rex's military legacy, Scout's therapeutic future, and soon, a new puppy to help 2 young boys navigate their unique challenges. I'll be in touch about the litter, Reeves promised as he prepared to leave. Should be early December if all goes well. Jackson watched him walk back to his vehicle, Scout leaning slightly against his prosthetic leg in a gesture that had become their particular form of connection. The weight was comforting rather than burdensome, a physical reminder of the partnership that had so unexpectedly transformed his life. 6 months later, Jackson stood proudly as Scout received his official service dog certification. The once abandoned puppy now performed his duties with precision and unwavering dedication. Together they'd visited the Riverside K9 facility when Sierra's puppies were born. Jackson had helped select a special female puppy for Lieutenant Reeves' grandsons, one with the same excessive empathic response that had once disqualified Scout. Jackson's apartment at Patriot Gardens had become a home filled with purpose. His nightmares were less frequent, his isolation replaced by community. He'd even started volunteering at the VA, helping other veterans navigate the complex benefit system he'd once struggled through alone. That evening, as Scout lay beside him wearing his new official service vest, Jackson reflected on how a single rainy night had changed everything. An abandoned puppy with a mysterious past had not only followed him home, but had led him toward healing, connection, and a renewed sense of mission. Some would call it coincidence that Scout was Rex's grandson. Others might say it was fate. Jackson simply knew that when two broken souls recognize each other, remarkable healing can begin. If you found hope in Jackson and Scout's journey, please subscribe for more stories that remind us how unexpected encounters can change our lives forever.